everybody, and welcome to another edition of There's a Will. It's about our, it seems like our 800th since the war began, but it's only about the 50-somethingth program since the war began. An hour each week of pure Central European and geopolitical comedy and entertainment. Of course, as you know, if you've been watching the program, it's just one laugh after another. And the joke is mostly on us, or on me anyway. I have in the studio, I'm very happy to have in the studio the director of the Atlantic Council in Warsaw, responsible for most of Central Europe, we can say, and things relative to Central Europe. Which is great. They have the office. They've reestablished it recently. And his name is Aaron Korewa. It's good to see you.
Thanks, Will. Thank you for having me.
We met in an interesting way. We were on the television on another station.
That's right. The TVP evening show where I, for some reason, had my little ear thingy wasn't working. Yeah. So there was another guy on the screen and I couldn't hear what he was saying. I suppose you did, because you guys started having a conversation. I was like, what are these guys talking about?
But that happened to me another time over there, so I know what it's like. And I just went,
oh, I'm sorry.
I didn't hear anything.
Maybe they're getting upset. Will we get upset?
I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear anything. That happened to me. And but luckily they fixed it after I said that. But these things happen, and live transmission. It's like going back to the 1950s or something, you know.
That's before my time.
Well, mine too. Yeah, but we have a thing called YouTube.
That's right.
And we also have reruns on the old television.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so it's very the 1950s are freely available.
Yeah.
Even the 1940s when TV actually started. Mm-hmm. I love all that stuff. I know more about the NFL in the 1950s than I do about it today, I think.
I have no idea about one thing or the other. For me, watching American football is like a social gathering when I used to live in the U.S. with friends, you know, beers, hot dogs, stuff like that. But I don't actually pay attention that much to the game in that sense. I prefer hockey, actually. But
do you?
Yeah.
Well, because you're from Sweden.
So I was born in Sweden. That's right. Yeah. Hockey country, and I think I prefer hockey to football because it's just faster. There are less breaks. You know, boom, 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 like this. Yeah. Whereas in football, it's like, okay, great. You know, here we go, the two sides, boom, and then it's like stops, right, and then boom. And so it's like
I understand.
Yeah. Hockey is just, it goes back.
When I was a kid, I loved hockey, and we even used to play a lot of street hockey.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
So I grew up in the South. We didn't have much.
Ice.
Yeah. Hardly ever. And when it was so slippery you couldn't play. So outside you just fall down. But it was a lot of fun. We used to play street hockey, follow the games, go to the games. Mm-hmm. It was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it tremendously. So I understand you. But you're born in Sweden?
That's right.
That's correct.
Yeah.
You were living in the United States for
yes,
some time.
I born in Sweden. I studied both in Sweden and in the U.S. actually. That was in Seattle. So my father was from New York State. So when my university in Sweden had an exchange program, I looked at where you could go. I decided let's go to the West Coast, as opposed to the East Coast, just because I wanted to do something different, right? So that's what I did. Came back, worked for a while for the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Actually, also was in the Swedish embassy in Warsaw because my mother is Polish, so I always had that little connection to Poland.
But Korewa is not a Polish name?
It is a Polish name. It's a Polish version of a Lithuanian name. It's originally Lithuanian.
Okay, Korewa.
So Lithuanian is not a Slavic language. So it's back in the days of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. A lot of Lithuanian nobility simply changed their names to make it sound more Polish because that was the way to go, so to speak. And so that's my family.
The fashion of the day.
That was the fashion of the day. Yeah.
Was it the 1500s?
Something like that. I mean,
because that was the heyday of the Polish-Lithuanian thing, wasn't it?
Yeah. There was. I mean, you had. It started. The union was. I think it started as much when Grand Duke Jogaila of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania became King of Poland. Yeah. And that was in the 1400s actually, or early 1400s. And then later you got this union, the Union of Lublin, and the two countries were intertwined more and more and more.
Yeah.
And given the fact simply that Poland was much bigger in terms of population, Lithuania was much bigger in terms of size. Today, Lithuania
at that time,
absolutely.
It's tiny now. It's just
today
a rump.
Well, I'm not going to use that. I'm not
it's just the backside of what it was.
I think Lithuania is a great country. It punches way above its weight. I am a huge fan of Lithuania. But back in those days, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania consisted not only of modern-day Lithuania, but also of Latvia, half of Estonia, all of Belarus, pretty much all of Ukraine, and actually parts of southwestern Russia. So
from the Baltic to the
exactly to the Black Sea, big country. However, the Lithuanians, as we know them today, are a Baltic people, and in terms of population, they were a small portion of the population of that entire state. And they looked around and they realized, well, we have enemies on all sides. They had the Teutonic Order in what's now Kaliningrad, or Prussia, as it was called back then. You had Russia, which was getting its act together and looking at these lands that the Lithuanians had controlled, and were like, well, this is something that we would like to have for ourselves. And they had Poland, and so they looked at all these three countries and said, like, okay, which one of these three should we have a partnership with? Which one would probably work out best for us? And they concluded it should be Poland. And so what happens is Grand Duke Jogaila of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania marries the Polish queen Jadwiga, who was something like 20 years younger than he was. And she was madly in love with the Archduke.
That's cradle robbing.
Well,
where I'm from.
Back in those days, back in those days, not unusual in the Middle Ages. We all know the story.
You get married at 12 or something.
I think Jadwiga was something like 16 at the time.
Oh, that's acceptable. She could drive a car.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I think Jogaila was way older. Jadwiga was also madly in love with the Archduke of Austria, who she was first betrothed to. So in the beginning, kind of didn't work. Anyway, back in those days, it is. Marriage sealed. Grand Duke Jogaila converts to Catholicism and is hailed as King Vladislav of Poland.
There you go.
But remains, the two countries are it's a personal union, one monarch but two different systems. Yeah. Eventually this union gets tighter and tighter intertwined.
It's so important to talk about this because to people who don't know the history, because
probably the most understudied political entity in European history is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
I think so. It really is almost, people keep it a secret. So it's very good that you illuminated us on that. The other thing is that now people are talking about that people have been talking about the intermarum between the Baltic and the Black Sea, as you described it, the size of the old Lithuania and Poland together, but Poland, of course, going further to the west. And there's the shifting boundaries of time. Poland started way over in what's now the Odra River and up to the Warta River around Poznan, Gniezno, and this area, and then going over to Krakow. This sort of area was really the heartland of Poland in its beginning 1,000 years ago, and surrounded, of course, by treacherous enemies and themselves. So they had become hardened to fight the Teutonic Knights, the Saxons from the Bohemians from the south, the Hungarians, etc. I go on the road and travel a lot doing my travel show, Poland Daily Travel, and been fortunate to do that. And it's fascinating, the stuff. I just found out, for example, when I was in, and then we'll move on to present business, but
it's your show.
I always like to, well, this is fun.
That's right.
And I think it's interesting for people to know some of these things. But it's like, I'll keep this brief, but I recently was over doing some programs near the border. And then I had this sudden feeling. I said, it's just like a epiphany or something. Not esprit de Scalia. That means something I forgot I should have said and I didn't at the moment. But it wasn't. It was just a thing that went through me and said, I bet that Dresden and that area was once part of Poland, or affiliated in some way. Maybe I had read it at some point or not.
Perfectly possible.
And but it was true, because I immediately Googled it. I said, what the heck is this? Why am I thinking this? And there was, at the end of the 1700s and into the beginning of the, at the end of the 1600s, beginning of the 1700s, there were two kings
That's right. Yeah, the Saxon kings. Yes.
That were in charge.
Although I do think that was also a personal union, because Saxony and the Commonwealth never shared borders. So today we think this is kind of weird. Like, what does that mean? But it's not. It's like Austria-Hungary. Towards the end, you have two countries. You have the same monarch, right? But they have two distinct political.
But again, that's not talked about.
No.
There was actually a Germanic. Saxon king in charge of Poland, which is interesting.
It is, and back in those days, that wasn't big of a deal. Today, of course, for obvious reasons, is something else. There is a lot of they're rebuilding the Saxon Palace in Warsaw. Right now, which for a long time was seen as, that's a German thing, forget about it. But now people are like, no, you know what? Part of our history, you might want to rebuild it.
That's a great idea, I think.
Yeah,
great idea to reclaim
I'm all for that too.
We were talking about that off camera. We were talking about that, and the need to understand history, which is why we started on that subject, I guess. But we also need to study how history affects contemporary issues. That's your job, and to some extent, it's my job. Let's say, and we've had, I first came to Poland because I wanted to understand what it was about this region that, when it was unstable, it created massive cataclysms, not just for Europe, but for the world. In fact, drew people into these large conflicts, particularly 20th century, but not only. Let's remember Napoleon and people like that. That somehow Poland, and even Poland and Lithuania, being strong, kept things in order. And I didn't understand why that was. And so I wanted to come and try and find out, as somebody who studied medieval history, I didn't get the answer, but my thesis was proved correct in the last year. Not that it makes me happy that it was proved correct. It's just like almost stunning that this thing has happened pretty much in a forecast way by some strategists like George Friedman and others. That we were also mentioning before. But that's kind of your job. I was looking at a website and came up with some interesting stories. One was about Turkey, but the other I think we should talk about is looking at some facts a year on, which are quite stunning, which are beautifully portrayed on the Atlantic Council website, which is, your job is what here? To analyze, right?
Yes, very much so, but also mainly the mission of the Warsaw office is to make sure that the voice of Poland is heard more in the transatlantic community.
Right. So you and I need to really work on this a lot together. This was why I wanted to invite you. I gathered that, but I wanted you to say to make sure I was correct.
For the simple reason that Poland turned out to be right on so many things.
Well, yes, on the Russian threat.
Yes, on the main threats and challenges that face the transatlantic community today, Poland was spot on.
Extraordinary, isn't it?
Many other countries were in denial.
Is that why the Atlantic Council decided, well, gosh, we need to get that office open again?
Actually, the decision was planned before the war, before the open, and also when we talk about the war, we're talking about the open aggression, right? There's been the open invasion.
There's been a war.
There's been a war since 2014, by Russian invasion of Ukraine, but the open aggression of Ukraine. The decision was made before that, because it's not just about Russia and the war. There are so many things where Poland and the U.S., because Atlantic Council is, of course, an American organization. There's so many issues and topics.
Since 1961.
That's right. It was founded basically because the U.S. had, as we all know, speaking of history, an isolationist streak before. There was plenty of people who are like, okay, done. We fixed Europe again, just as we did back in 1918, whatever.
And done. 45.
Yeah, let's go back. Let's go back to where we are not. We are not.
Oh, you're talking about interwar.
Yeah, that's right. So
Lindberghism.
If you look at America in the interwar years, very much like no. We are not like these Europeans. We were doing other stuff here.
That's right.
But also, the United States was also a country that pursued its interest around the world in a rather what you would call aggressive, bullyish manner, right? We are upcoming big, strong power. We can pretty much do what we want. And it was only later that smart people in the U.S. realize that, well, that's one way of doing it, but
it also has consequences.
It has consequences. Yeah. It's much better. It's expensive. It's much better to forge these partnerships and alliances because it's leadership, right? Yeah. American leadership. This is how we make the world safe for ourselves in the U.S. and for the rest of the world. America benefits from having a rules-based international system. Absolutely. It doesn't benefit from a might makes right kind of system. There are some people who used to believe that. There are some people who still believe that.
That's the Russian attitude.
And that is the Russian attitude. It's not working. Exactly.
Have they ever won a war?
The Russians, yes, when they're part of an international coalition.
We can even say an Anglo.
Yeah, coalition. Exactly. On their own, Russia's track record of invading other countries is not very good. Yeah.
And we can't have people saying, "Oh, Napoleon was defeated by the." He wasn't. He was defeated by the weather and the British revving up to. Yeah. On
Russia
the
wasn't
western
alone
side,
in the Napoleonic Wars.
On the western side.
Yeah,
people forget that.
Yeah.
Because Waterloo, of course, happened after Napoleon had been exiled the first time. Yeah, he was exiled twice.
Plus,
a lot of people don't know that.
That's true, and plus, how many countries? I mean, Russia's unique geography. I mean, how many countries can just keep retreating, burn their own capital, and just go away? But again, it's important for the listeners and the viewers who should remember there is a big difference when it comes to Russia in terms of a defensive war, right?
Yes.
When they are being invaded versus offensive war. Russia's track record for doing offensive war...
I find their wars very offensive, actually.
Sorry.
I find this particular war very offensive.
This war is extremely offensive, and it's also a war where Russia is invading another country. And when it comes to Russia's track record of invading other countries alone, without being part of an international coalition, it's not that great. It's not good at all. It's not.
And they needed support. Without the United States supplying the goods to both the Russians and the British...
in the Lend-Lease program.
Somehow, the Germans... Good Lord, it was close, wasn't it? Yeah.
It's pretty interesting that back in those, I mean, immediately after the war, Stalin, Khrushchev, Zhukov, all these top Soviet leaders kept repeating over and over again, the Lend-Lease saved us. Without the American Lend-Lease program, we would have been in trouble because it's a historical fact.
They would have never won Stalingrad.
Absolutely not. This whole thing that Putin is doing now, that we defeated fascism on our own, that's not only is that false, that's also fairly new in the way that the propaganda works.
Can I ask you
During
a question?
Soviet times, they would often emphasize the fact that we were doing this together.
Yes, and absolutely. And you well summed up. And you said fascism. What do you say about the people who say there's this Zelensky? I hear Americans saying this, particularly certain, not cadres, but I don't think it's organized, but voices in America. That there's a strong neo-fascist, they're almost echoing the Russian propaganda. I've never seen that in Ukraine. No. Even on Maidan, I was there twice during that time, right before the second invasion and right after the beginning of the protest, December and then March, 2014 and 15. And I didn't see, I knew that people go, oh, those are the right-wing guys, but nobody took it seriously, those guys. And I don't think it is serious. I'm very surprised to hear supposedly intelligent people, I wonder, saying that, and I wonder what kind of axe they're grinding. I mean, yes, you can say we need to follow, it's often followed by, yes, and we need to follow the money, because we don't want it going into oligarchs and neo-fascist hands. It's a lot of money, that's true. But everywhere, did anybody ever see Kelly's Heroes?
Yeah.
It's all about stealing gold by the American soldiers.
Right. I mean, the thing. I think that the whole. I mean, what you just said there, with with the money going. I think there is a certain streak of thought in the U.S. again that basically is after America again, like isolating itself from the rest of isolation, and they're just looking for reasons to do so. Yeah. As far as the far right in Ukraine, again, facts speak for themselves. The Svoboda Party has one seat in the Rada, and the support in the latest polls is something like 2.5%. I mean, this is way lower than far-right parties tend to have all over Europe. far right.
France
comes to mind, where
Think about France.
they just came close to
Le Pen.
Exactly Le Pen and the election.
Père and daughter.
And
father and daughter.
I mean, Russia, for God's sakes, has a far right that not only is way bigger than is Ukraine, they're actually in power. Because if you look at classical fascism, I mean, Vladimir Putin checks most of these boxes.
Well, that's it's bizarre. And then the same people are saying, the Russian, we got to stop this war. We can't give them money. Actually, $100 billion to the United States is a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
If they were worried about money, they shouldn't have shut everything down during COVID.
Which
is another story.
Speaking of statistics, speaking of statistics, which we might get into. I mean,
I want to get into it.
There was a report.
We're probably going to go to break and then come back and start with.
Just to quickly, as an example.
We got a few minutes.
Okay. There was an article. Let's say month or something like that. We did a calculation. The amount of money that the U.S. has spent on supporting Ukraine is something. It's like around 6% of the U.S. defense budget.
Right.
So for 6% of the U.S. defense budget, we have degraded the army of the Russian Federation, one of our main enemies, to this point. I mean, over half of the Russian tanks
can I clarify?
have been destroyed.
The dictator Putin's army.
Yes, the dictator Putin
is really what it is.
Right, the dictator.
I want to say that. It doesn't represent all Russians. We know that.
No, we know that.
And
unfortunately,
it should be emphasized, that he doesn't represent all Russians, and they need to do something about this internally, which is very difficult with a dictator. We saw Franco, just forget all the others, but we saw Franco lasting forever in Europe as a dictator. Portugal also had problems with the same type of thing post World War II.
Well, that's an important story. But I mean, the point being is that for this, it's one of the best return of investments we have ever seen. Yeah. For less than 6% of U.S. defense budgets, we have degraded the Russian military up to this point. So people are saying that somehow the U.S. can't walk and chew gum at the same time. That's ridiculous. Of course we can. We have to. We have to
in order to protect the post-war creations, which basically led to American business being able, and not only, but all people being able to, through secure trade routes, being able to trade,
of course,
and safety throughout the world, and also for American business to be able to go abroad, and not only, but Western business,
absolutely,
and also to be able to exchange, even with China. Yes. I mean, China was opened by the American initiative. Yes. People forget that.
The Chinese forget that they're a huge benefit of the rules-based international
They'll
order.
Remember if it's cut off.
For sure.
Then
and
they're destroyed.
The American isolationists forget that at that time, when the U.S. was up in the 19th century, because they often have the 19th century as some sort of ideal. In the 19th century, the sea lanes were kept open by the British Royal Navy. So you had a country which may not have been best friends with the U.S. in the 19th century. Certainly not. The British Empire and the Americans were not.
Somewhat rivalrous.
Somewhat rivalrous, but at the same time, the Brits were like, we're not going to try to reconquer America. I mean, I'm not talking about 1812.
Post-Civil War, it was pretty much, they were pretty, let's work in tandem sort of thing.
Exactly. We don't want, they had the similar interests. The Brits
they were protecting the world. You're right. They were protecting the world while America was growing. It's an industry. Till up to the First World War, America was the greatest producer in the world, surpassing Great Britain. But Great Britain was keeping international control, so they, in some ways, had to work together.
And I have the greatest respect for Britain today and for the Royal Navy and all that. But the idea that the Royal Navy is just going to replace the U.S. Navy right here, right now, to keep the sea lanes open in the world, I'm not so sure
it has to be
about that.
It has to be a cooperative situation. With the British and Americans are the ones only competent people to run navies. The British don't have the money to keep it up, but they're certainly confident with what they do have.
I don't want to call. I'm not going to use any names, but I remember a conversation I had with one of these people in the U.S. who was pro-isolationism way back when I moved to the States in 2016, and this guy told me, well, what's this whole thing about patrolling the sea lanes? Why do we have to, meaning we Americans have to? You know that the Germans used to have a pretty good navy once upon a time.
What?
And I'm like, you're referring to the Hochseeflotte? Yeah. It's like, first of all, you just have to be in Germany for like 5 seconds to realize that the idea that they're going to recreate the Kaiserreich's navy just like that ain't going to happen.
But all those ships were sunk anyway.
Yeah, number one. Number two,
except the U-boats were sunk.
Yeah, but why in the Holy Mother would any American want the Germans to patrol the sea lanes instead of the Americans?
I don't know. It seems to me, as Norm Macdonald pointed out, I don't know which group in the world frightens you the most. But for me, I don't know if you know much about history, but it's the Germans.
Well, they're
if you're a history buff, I don't know if you're a history buff.
Well,
it's very famous.
You could also do the famous South Park joke, right? Who is our oldest enemy? Who's America's oldest enemy? And the other, I forgot who says it, but it's one of the kids. Yeah. And one character goes like, the Germans, and they're like, no, the Germans again. He says, no, not that, the red coat. And okay, so going, that's but that's South Park.
That's all we got. We'll come back after the break. Hey, watch these messages of interest. They're exciting, and you can do nudity at home while you watch them. And we'll be back with Aaron Korewa, director of the Atlantic Council in Warsaw. Thanks for watching. Yes, indeed, all roads do lead to Poland. Hope you enjoyed those adverts. Worked very hard on getting those in. It kind of pays for things. So go out and buy all those products, whatever they were. I don't know what they were, but enjoy those products. And I'm a pitch man,
Nice pitch.
They used to do that in the old school, in the shows. They would be on the Johnny Carson show. You ever heard of the guy?
Mm-hmm.
You know that guys?
Mm-hmm.
They used to do, Ed McMahon would go, here's a dog food that you should buy. It was hilarious. I love those old things. I wish they still did that.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's better than the actual conversation with an actor.
Could be, yeah. I loved Polish ads back in the 90s. I was born in '84, so I remember ads in the, I don't remember the communist times that much, obviously, but I remember post-communism fairly well. And
well,
funny ads of...
the 90s was your time to actually become cognizant what's going on.
Hilarious, Polonia 2000 washing detergent, which was advertised with these Polish noblemen, from the Potop movie, Ojciec Pracz, and all that.
All those movies were huge.
They were huge.
The historical movies from the Sienkiewicz books, etc.
That's right. Classics.
Yeah. Listen, so we're coming back. We're joined by Olgierd Uziemblo, friend of the show. You there, Olgierd? Yes, there he is. Looking very academic because he is academic. And this is no, we didn't, you really are an academic. So, and that, I hardly know what to say to you. I should have done...
Well, sir, I do some research in alphabets and writing systems, and the most interesting case that I found recently would be the Tatar writing, which was putting down in letters of Arabic provenance the language of Belorussia Polish border. A very interesting case.
Yes, okay. And Aaron, you take
okay.
Way above my, that went right over my head. Something about Tatar writing and translation.
The multicultural history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I told you, understudied. One of the most understudied entities, political entities in Europe.
That's why what you said was brilliant, even as a joke, because we were talking about just what Aaron said in the first part of the program, son. At any rate, I want to come to some facts. Wait, I turn my chair around and I'm going to get really serious. Like hard talk now, we're going to grill you. And I hope you've memorized all these facts. No.
Read them before I got here.
Just there was an article in Atlantic Council, and I thought it was interesting on your website about just some interesting factoids. Is it a factoid? Facts.
Facts.
Why do you call them factoids?
Factoid is what people believe and it's not actually true.
Yeah, okay. These are facts.
Yeah.
I think.
For instance, people think that there's a King Louis in the Jungle Book, even though there isn't. In the original book, there is no King Louis. There are no orangutans in India, for God's sake. They live in Indonesia. No, Indonesia, it's a completely different country.
Great Scott.
Yeah, it's
and no tigers in Africa.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Where are they? No, there aren't any.
They're in India.
Yeah, they're in India.
Bengal.
Yeah.
Bengal.
And Russia, Siberia.
And Sri Lanka, they swim across.
That's right.
The Tiger Straits.
That's what they're called?
And Siberian tiger.
They call it the tiger.
We became like a ping pong match here. Speaking of factoids, right?
They call it, that's a factoid. Isn't that true, Olgierd? I always go to Olgierd for intellectual backing. Isn't that true that the tigers swim across? Never mind.
Tigers, do not forget about tigers in Siberia.
That's right.
That's right. Of course.
Yeah.
That's
Siberian
famous.
tiger.
Yeah. But we have these facts, like how much area would you reckon that Russia has taken in the, from before in 2014, 15, but 2015 actually, but through the war now, how much territory?
How much territory,
Yeah.
like the
What do you
current, how
think
much
they
they
have
control right now?
Control it?
So I'm not a numbers guy, but is it something like 17% of Ukraine, if we count the 91 borders, that includes Crimea and everything, or are we adding from
It's
the
probably not far off. It's 108
Right.
1,000 square miles.
Right.
I don't know how big this is, but it's about the size of Estonia and
That's
Lithuania
right.
since we're present day. Since we were talking about that before. So that's some point of reference. Glad I wrote that down relative to what you were saying, to geography here. So it's quite a chunk, and it's stretching from where is it?
It's stretching from Donetsk all the way, like a belt, all the way to Crimea. Kind of linked up Crimea with those territories that Russia used to occupy between 2014 and 2022, which that was roughly less than half of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, I believe.
Yeah.
And it was, of course, it was separated from Crimea. Now they sort of linked up with this land bridge that goes through Mariupol and all those territories, like a,
That's
like
right.
a belt.
They've cut off and created that land bridge.
Which is a big area. I mean, of course, Ukraine is a big country, but that is a big area, like you said. That's two countries, two Baltic countries.
Yeah, and Ukraine being about the size of Texas. So, yeah.
Quite a lot.
Another one. Now, the thing we need to remember is the amount of refugees that have been through, and I suppose all of us, to some extent or another, have had contact and provided aid or help or money or something, or direction or networking to refugees, of which 8 million came through Poland. Isn't that right?
I think it's somewhere between 5 or 8 million. I'm not sure. I know there's a 1.5 million Ukrainian refugees in Poland that have stayed in Poland.
That's right.
That are staying in Poland right now. And then as the total amount of refugees that have passed through Poland is something, the number I've heard is 5 million, but it may be higher. I'm not sure, but it's a lot. It's a lot.
Yes.
And that means passing through Poland to other European countries, but also coming to Poland and returning to Ukraine and going back again.
So the biggest countries with refugees, Olgierd, maybe you can help us out here. Is Poland number one?
In terms of absolute numbers, yes.
Numbers,
I think Germany is the second one, I believe.
And Germany is second, yeah. What would be third?
Is it Czech Republic?
Yes, I think it is.
And and also remember the Czech Republic is a much smaller country, both in terms of territory and number of people. So I believe the Czech Republic is actually the highest if it's per capita.
Per capita, it's only a couple hundred thousand.
But in total numbers, Poland is way ahead of all the countries than Germany and then I believe it's
also as a conduit for the people leaving the country and for aid going across the border.
Right.
I mean, Olgierd, I remember in a previous program you were talking about the presence of military, NATO military in your area east of the country, yes?
Yes.
You run into them quite often, you said, even when you were walking.
Recently I hear them more often, they run into them, but you can see them sometimes on the roads.
Yeah.
You can see them if you go gathering mushrooms in the forest,
Yeah, it's just become, in the eastern part of this country, it's become a fact of life that you see soldiers. And how many American soldiers? Is it 45,000?
I mean, not in Poland as far as
in Central Europe.
In Central Europe, in total, that might be the case. I mean, we have.
Does that include Romania?
Arriving, leaving, coming, leaving the different groups, trading. Because I live not very far from the military field of Czerwony Bór, which is not close to the border. If you live close to the border, there are even enclosed areas because of the border problem with Belarus. So there is a
Belarus. There's a big problem that we saw even before the war started, several months before.
On the refugee thing and factoids.
Yeah, please.
You should know that Russian friends very often mention that they had 2 million refugees from Ukraine, and this is very important because they are providing help as well, just like the other countries. And the 2 millions. But then if you check carefully their own records, they have granted refugee status to maybe 200,000 people, and all the other people were passing through to the other countries, running away from Russia as far as possible. But they are dressing themselves up also as a refugee center.
Yeah, but a lot of it's hard to. A lot of those people are kidnapped, aren't they, or just removed by
Forceful removal. Classic Russia.
Yeah.
Right?
This was just classic. I mean, Siberia is a famous home for people from Central Europe.
Oh yes. Nothing changes, unfortunately.
Not with
it's
Russia.
the same. It's the same thing. It's Russia is not
Same geopolitical
But Russia has not changed.
tectonic plates, if you can.
Unfortunately, what we see in this war, this is Russia digging up the deepest, darkest elements of the 1930s and using them again. This is a country that simply didn't reform, and that's just a fact. A lot of countries in Europe did, Russia did not. Russia is Europe's last colonial empire. They think like a colonial empire, and they believe that Ukraine is a lost province of this empire. And if that's what you believe in, then none of this is strange.
And not only, if some of the strategists like George Friedman are to be believed, and I think he's got a good case based on what's happening in the last year, that in fact, Putin's end game is to take back piece by piece as much as he can, if not everything, of the old Soviet
For
empire.
sure, yeah.
It seems, that's why I don't understand. It seems to me the people who don't support and are isolationists in the United States or other countries in Europe are not students of history at all. I mean, pick up a book. Even James Michener would do. You know, it's easy to read fictional history.
Right, because I mean, this is not like we're not talking ancient Babylon here, right?
No.
The Cold War, Russia had, if you want to be a devil's advocate thing here, Russia controlled half of Europe.
Yeah.
And it's not like they were nice back then. So why do we think that they would like take as much as they want and then calm down? Like, where does that idea come from? This is completely
it's not gonna happen.
ahistorical.
It's not going to happen. And we see Moldova, you know.
Never
now.
mind the fact that like the people in Ukraine and in Central Eastern Europe do not want to be governed by Moscow. So how do these people imagine that we're just going to give them these territories with the people in them and everything's going to be fine? Like, we don't live in the 1940s anymore where you could like, you know, lock up millions of people behind an iron curtain. The modern world just doesn't work that way. Case in point, Ukraine.
They can't do it. There's too much flow of information as well.
They're still trying to do it, though.
Sorry?
They're still trying to do it.
Absolutely.
You know.
Well, they're trying.
They're trying,
That's the point, isn't it?
unreformable.
I'm really amazed sometimes by the Western countries. Well, the Western countries, not like us, Poland. They do think that appeasement works. It's like as if 20th century never happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, this
Absolutely right.
is an excellent point. And also with a leader who looks back to, I mean, Russia says, oh, we were here first. They weren't at all. Russia's only a few hundred years, you know, it's just before,
Especially
it was
the
just
Russian
established
Empire.
just before Jamestown was settled by the British. So, not only that, you have, as you say, the unreformed person in charge, and who looks to Ivan the Terrible, who was the original creator of the Tsar. The Tsarist
Great
regime,
article
Tsarist
in
kingdom.
Financial Times recently about how this whole thing came about with the open invasion, where a lot of the Russian people, elements in the Russian government, had no idea what was going on, and this took them completely by surprise. And it's there was a question asked to Lavrov. And it was like, well, who are Putin's advisors? Who is this guy listening to? Like, who came up with the idea that this is going to work? To which Lavrov responds, he has 3 advisors: Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great.
I remember hearing that. Yeah, that's true.
There you go.
And that's interesting because we kind of knew that. We were talking about that here in this
Which, by the way, Putin
studio.
is not even trying to hide this. I mean, there was
doesn't-
a speech
he
by
says
Putin
it.
when he's talking openly about comparing himself to Peter the Great.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, well, Peter the Great was a pretty interesting guy. I mean, St. Petersburg is marvelous, and he did do some pretty good things. But Catherine the Great was a pretty difficult character, and certainly Ivan the Terrible didn't get his name for nothing.
which, by the way, he's not called the Terrible in Russian. Grozny in Russian is not terrible. It means more harsh, severe,
threatening or something like
but
that.
it's not a bad thing.
Yeah, not necessarily.
No, for the Russian
For the
ideas,
Russians,
it's
yeah,
not
but for us,
seen
it
as
sounds
You know
pretty
the
bad.
name of
That's
the
very good.
Chechen capital.
Yeah, Grozny, yeah, that's right.
Ah, that's
The same-
good
Same.
to remember. Thank you. Olgierd, yeah. All right, here's one that didn't take me by surprise, but I think it's an astounding fact. How many of the Russian active tank force? They got 17,000 in storage. No one knows what condition they're in. Around that amount. That's a lot, but most of it's probably junk. the great percentage of it, would have to be totally reworked. They have problems with parts, even with the tanks that are still working. How much would you reckon they lost of their active tank force?
About half.
Yeah.
I think it's slightly above half.
Yeah, according to your article, it's 52%. So, yeah, that wasn't a test, but gosh, that's true. Now that I look at it, because I'd forgotten actually exactly how much it was. Now I got it written here. 3,300 something tanks, minus 1,700, so about half, which is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, we sat here in this studio the first week of the war. We started. I went to Lviv, came back, saw what was going on with the refugee flow, and said, "My God, this is going to go on for a while. We need to start focusing on this story. It's going to run, and it's going to be captivating in every way you can imagine, and essential, as we all know now." But looking at, we sat in the studio, and we talked about the Russians can't do this. They need 1 million properly trained and armed people just to occupy the country, right?
Yeah.
Because they don't have the overwhelming force that, say, the Nazis did back then. That doesn't exist now in the same way.
Yeah, this is really interesting because when we were looking at the pre-open invasion, exactly that. I mean, it looks like the Russians kind of got inspiration from the 2003 war in Iraq. You know, how we're just going to go in and boom, bam, and
yeah, but they looked more like the Iraqi army.
Right, exactly.
Which is not the Americans.
You would almost, it's like, I mean, don't get me wrong here. Like, obviously, I don't feel this way, but you almost feel kind of sorry for it when you look at the planning, because it's so bizarre.
I feel sorry for the people. Yeah.
Yeah, but the Russian military. So if you look at their plan here, right? It's basically, they've been, if you look at the Russian exercises in the Zapad, right? They trained for this massive war with NATO, right? Boom, bam, you know, throw in everything you got, end on a note with a nuclear weapon, right? Yeah. But then the wars that they had actually been fighting up until then were exactly the opposite. These small little operations in Syria where they were just flying around.
Destruction.
Yeah, just flying around with planes, you know, fighting unfortunate Syrians who only had a Kalashnikov, if even that, to defend themselves.
When they came up against, in Syria, when the Air Force came up against American pilots, American forces, they were just
different
destroyed.
Story, but I'm talking about being...
Yeah, but I just thought it was worth
Georgia,
making your point stronger.
Yes, Georgia, same in 2008. The Russian military didn't perform well in that war. Unfortunately, the Georgian military didn't either, and Georgia is a fairly small country.
I was there. They did not perform well.
They did not perform well. Yeah. And Ukraine in 2014, which at that time, the Ukrainian military was in a very poor state. So there were two main engagements between the Russian military of the day and the Ukrainian military of the day. One of them was the famous battle with the airport and the cyborgs in Ukraine. And the Russian military prevailed both times. Yeah. So the Russians looked at it and go like, well, no problem, right? We're just going to go in. Well, they missed the fact that a lot of things had changed in Ukraine between 2014 and 2022. Yeah. So they were training for this. They had been training for this massive war, right, with NATO. They'd been doing something completely different. And now they were kind of doing this middle hybrid whatever. And we know now that the officers, the soldiers, the men, they had no idea what they were doing. They were like, well, you know, we're here to exercise. Go over there. Like, it's over there. The exercise over there. And all of a sudden, they find themselves in Ukraine. And they're like, well, what's going on? Well, you're supposed to drive on this road here. Like, how do you expect that to work? But again, this is what happens in authoritarian powers, right? The circle of advisors becomes smaller and smaller. Exactly. Yeah. Echo chamber. None of this is new. We've seen this movie before. We've seen it many times. And this regime has been in power.
And we talked about that here.
Yeah. Has been in power for 20 years.
There was going to be a problem. There's a chain of command.
Yeah.
There are no sergeants or chain of command in the field to take initiative. Everybody's afraid they're going to be knocked off. They're so busy worrying about being knocked off by the dictator that they just impale themselves on the enemy's
weapons.
A
word of caution, though, as that FT article points out, now that this has happened, Putin is determined, he's digging in. In an authoritarian state, yes, you can have a small circle of advisors, and that could lead you astray, but the trump card that they sort of have is that you can also change things very quickly, right? That's something. Change things very quickly. Up until a certain. That's important.
This is a very good point.
And you can decide that, well, you know, sure, we made mistakes, but if I only throw in a few thousand more men into this meat grinder, it's gonna work. it's going to prevail. And again, I don't necessarily blame Russia for believing this, because this is what they've been doing. It's worked before for them.
It never really worked, though.
Well, it's worked in some. This is how certain wars
with
have
help
worked.
With help. Outside.
With help.
Yeah.
But more importantly,
as we said in the first.
Exactly. More importantly, the Russians believe that Putin believes that he has staying power, and the West does not. And that's what I don't blame him for, because unfortunately we've sent him the wrong signals for such a long time. The Western country. And again, as your other guest said, West,
that's
I mean
Olgierd Uziemblo.
Sorry, that's right. As Olgierd said, the West, I'm talking about the West, not about Poland, because Poland was right about this all along. But several Western countries sent the wrong messages to Putin on so many occasions. Georgia is a good example. Sarkozy came up with this plan of, we're going to put in sanctions if Russia doesn't, retreat, yada, yada, all that. Great plan on paper, but we didn't enforce it. True. We didn't do anything. So, why?
A friend of mine was just in Georgia, went right to the border. So, he's been on the show before, Mike Houlihan, and Houlihan, like a famous bar in America. And he went right to the border skiing. So he was up in the top of the mountains, and there were Russians around and talking to them, and just people. A lot of people left to Georgia, so you run into them naturally. Because Georgia's full of Russians right now, taking the escape route that they could find. And the proximity to Russian invasion is very obvious there. I mean, they could invade Georgia easily. I mean, it's hard to know why they left the first time. But I can tell you this. I remember this. The long line of Russian tanks that we passed going to Gori looked like as ragtag and disorganized as Kelly's Heroes. I love to use that because it reminds me so much of the Russian army. It's kind of vigilante, and half the guys look like Donald Sutherland, and they got beards, and nobody's washed, and even though they're not in the field for that long, in this case, it's only a couple of weeks, and the tanks don't look in great repair, the guys don't have universal uniforms that match, and it was just very odd. And again, you felt kind of sorry for them.
Well,
in a sense, it's like, God, this is going to be a cataclysm.
But in those days, two things, right? First of all, the meat grinder kind of method worked, but only because, again, the Georgian armed forces were unfortunately not that great either, and the country is small, and it could be done. But secondly, the Russians did learn a lot of lessons from that war, and that's another important point, that they do improve and change every now and then.
I'm going to give. Thank you. We're running out of time.
That's
unbelievable.
Right.
This is one that's gone so fast. Olgierd, I want to give you the last word, if I may. Are you there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Yeah. Okay. There you are. Last word.
What do you mean?
Is the money? Because we're going to finish the show now, but you got a couple of minutes. Is the money spent by the United States and the 50 billion euros by the EU, the $100 billion, 50 billion by the EU, 100 billion by the United States, well spent or not on this war?
Well, you would need to ask the people that are in the field whether they see the money or not. But I think that, well, it's better to spend those money on helping Ukraine in any way than just ignoring the war. Because it's hard for me to say, I'm a linguist. It's hard for me to say whether the money are well spent or not. I know that some things are working, and I know one thing, that things that Russians say, they tend to materialize on the battlefield. And they keep on saying that they're going to take the old Russian city of Warsaw. And you yourself probably know how Russian Warsaw is.
Oh, yeah. Very, very, very
note.
Russian. And in Russian minds, but not in our minds. Not in the Polish mind, and not in the minds of people who live here and know it well. Still, this history, this mixed bag of history, this continual shifting borders has always made Central Europe a place where, and Eastern Europe, a place where conflict can break out. It's the reason I originally came.
Well, that's why after the Second
World
War, it was designed not to take anybody's land. So the borders became kind of sacred in Central Europe. And once you start playing with it, and who started playing with it?
What a great
not
point.
Us,
Excellent.
the
point.
Russians. And they keep on avoiding answering that question. Why the hell you guys started playing with it? And they did.
Very good. We got to end there.
It's Transnistria.
We've got to end there, but that's why I went to you, Olgierd, because you summed it up beautifully. And we thank you even for your short appearance in the second half. We appreciate you being here. As always, Olgierd Uziemblo, instructor, professor, translator of Chinese, speaks Chinese, writes Chinese, and apparently deciphers ancient Sanskrit Tartar manuscripts. I don't know. Sanskrit? I think I made a mistake. Sanskrit? Isn't that? That's not Tartar.
I think
that might be Egyptian, mightn't it? I don't know. I don't know.
Great.
I'm not a linguist. I can barely speak English. Anybody who watches this, I hope this show was reasonably watchable. I know that I really enjoyed having you, Aaron, seeing you again, having you here on the show. And boy, very illuminating. I could see why they made you director of the Atlantic Council, because it's another fine mind present on the scene here.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you, Olgierd Uziemblo. And thank you for watching. And may I say, you're looking well. Why don't you stay that way?